Hello. Today I'm here to discuss with you guys and hopefully break down and make it a little easier to understand the organism effects that occur under the category of radiation biology. First off, apologies if this is not the best audio quality. I'm using a donor laptop and there's no microphone port, so here we are. Um, for reference, for my students listening, this is from your textbook Radiography in the Digital Age, and this is chapter 42. So, two broad categories of effects, deterministic and stochastic. Deterministic effects are those typically most associated with early effects of radiation, and like the name implies, there's some quality of determinism to it, being that the effect is determined by the dose received. Um, and it's reliable, it's empirical, it is said to be certain. Stochastic effects, on the other hand, it's not so easy to understand right at face value. Stochastic just means random, unpredictable. Deterministic effects, they increase in severity with an increasing dose, and they are associated with a threshold. Severity increases because of an increased number of cells damaged, and again, considered certain to occur to the exposed individual. And again, provided the threshold for whatever effect we're talking about has been reached. They occur after large doses, such as those seen in radiation therapy, and are possible in C-arm fluoroscopy and angiography. But again, if you're a limited X-ray tech student in my class, you won't be exposed to C-arm or angiography. So in the types of diagnostic radiography that we train for, it's not a consideration. We don't cause deterministic effects. Examples of these are erythema of the skin, and again, these examples are implying either whole body or partial body, partial tissue, and we haven't defined that yet, but in any case, erythema of the skin, decreased blood cell counts, those are red cells, white cells, and platelets, epilation, fibrosis, epilation is hair loss, by the way, atrophy, sterility or decreased gamete count. And again, these are generally effects that are only seen at high levels of ionizing radiation, such as those seen in radiation therapies. Most early effects of radiation are deterministic. So again, associate, for the most part, deterministic effects with being early effects, those seen within the first hours, days, or weeks after exposure to an acute dose of radiation. An example of a late effect that is deterministic, has a threshold, is well documented to occur, is cataract of the lens of the eye. And the deterministic effects, they do follow a non-linear threshold response curve, threshold being an S-shaped curvature with an inflection point, and we call that sigmoidal. Stochastic effects, these are the effects which increase in probability with an increasing dose. There is no threshold for a stochastic effect to occur, and severity is independent of dose. So it's an all or none phenomenon. Any amount of exposure may produce a stochastic effect. The likelihood, the probability of the effect happening goes down with a decrease in exposure and up proportionally with an increase in exposure. And again, we're only calculating the probability, not the severity. The odds of a particular individual experiencing the effect are small because these are measured statistically within large populations. And they occur at low dose levels, like the ones we have control over in our routine diagnostic radiography. Examples of stochastic effects, late effects of radiation typically, including carcinogenic effects, being neoplasms, new growth or tumor or cancerous mass, cancer, however you want to word that one, and most genetic or hereditary effects, the effects that you pass down to your offspring. The response curve associated with this is a linear non-threshold response curvature, so there's a proportional increase in probability with increase in exposures, doses. The early effects of radiation. Early effects are defined as those that manifest within hours, days, or weeks after radiation exposure. Early effects are associated with acute doses of radiation, that is, a large and typically single or very few doses of radiation. Late effects occur within several months to years later. 90% of somatic damage, and somatic means damage to someone. So about you, yourself. So 90% of somatic damage from radiation is repairable, but there is a cumulative roughly 10% that is permanent and does go up. The damage increases as repeat exposures to radiation increase. So these early effects are considered somatic, not genetic, deterministic, not stochastic. They are non-linear in their response, and they do observe a threshold. So, for example, this graph shows a response right around 50 milligray, with an inflection point around 100 milligray, and a maximum response somewhere around 125 milligray, where you see no increase in exposure. That's what's called the shoulder of the graph. So this is what we mean when we say a nonlinear threshold response curve that is sigmoidal, as in S-shaped. Whole body early effects. So again, these effects are assuming whole body exposure, not partial tissue exposure. At 250 millisieverts, we see a decreased blood cell count. And I want to take a second here to mention that the unit we're using is important, the millisievert. So what we have here is an equivalent dose or effective dose. Assuming this is a equivalent dose, they mean that they've taken the gray of the absorbed dose and multiplied it by some radiation weighting factor to give you the sievert. An example: 1 gray of X-rays is not equal to 1 sievert of X-rays is not equal to 1 sievert of alpha particles. Alpha radiation is about 20 times more harmful than X-rays, so given 1 gray of X-rays and 1 gray of alpha radiation, you'd calculate 1 sievert of equivalent dose for the X-rays and 20 sieverts of equivalent dose for the alpha radiation. So sievert takes into account another factor beyond just the absorbed dose. In any case, 250 millisieverts decreased blood cell counts. So you see suppression of erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes. At double that dose, 500 millisieverts, and keep in mind this is cumulative, so you're not skipping over anything. If you receive 500 millisieverts, then you also have a decreased blood cell count. You just add on loss of lymphocytes. So 500 millisieverts, we add on a 50% loss of lymphocytes. So that damages severely your ability for your immune system to respond. And we see, you may see, statistically see patients dying of infection, chronic and recurrent infection after this type of lymphocyte loss. At 1 sievert, this is the threshold for human death. So 1 gray of X-rays to the entire body is enough to kill a human. Between 3.5 and 4 sieverts, this is what's called the LD 50/30 for humans. This is the lethal dose that would kill 50% of the population within 30 days. So, hypothetical, expose the entire population to 4 sieverts of irradiation, and half of them die within 30 days of exposure. Between 6 and 7 sieverts, this is the lethal dose for the human population, what we call the LD 100-60. We'll describe that in a little bit. Partial body early effects. As low as 50 millisieverts, we see chromosome aberrations. This is still above the diagnostic level. So 50 millisieverts, for reference, is your, as the X-ray tech, your yearly dose limit, your dose equivalent limit, 50 millisieverts. So at 50 millisieverts of an acute dose, we see chromosome changes. 2 sieverts, we see erythema, reddening of the skin. And at 3 sieverts, we see epilation or hair loss. And keep in mind, these are partial body. Serious skin burns to patients have been reported in modern times for cardiovascular or interventional and C-arm procedures that may have very long accumulated exposure time. So this is like a severe sunburn or tissue burn from gonadal early effects. The threshold doses for those, 100 millisieverts to a male, we see a decreased sperm count after a few weeks. A few weeks because there are mature sperm and there are immature sperm. The mature sperm would still be viable because they're more radio resistant due to specialization and the loss of mitosis and meiosis. The more immature sperm, they're the ones that are susceptible. So after a few weeks, you see the sperm counts go down. 100 millisieverts to a female, we see suppressed menstrual periods, so she may not ovulate and loss of the menstrual period. 2 sieverts, temporary infertility in both sexes. 5 sieverts, permanent sterility in both sexes. Delivered to the whole body, though, keep in mind, more than half of the human population dies from 5 sieverts. So this is keeping in mind a strictly gonadal dose, not a whole body dose. Lethal doses. Lethal doses are expressed as capital L, capital D, with a subscript of X/Y, where X is the percentage of the population that will die, and Y is the number of days over which this is measured. An example, the LD5030 for monkeys is 4 sieverts. This means that if a large group of monkeys is exposed to 4 sieverts, 50% of them die from it within 30 days. And this is can be extended with medical treatment or not, but statistically it still evens out to be that. Examples for different species of the LD5030, monkeys and humans are similar, where humans are slightly lower, roughly 4 gray. Rats and mice, 9 gray. Goldfish, 20 gray, and insects significantly higher. This is why we hear about the cockroach being able to survive a nuclear attack, because they can survive large exposures to ionizing radiation, and most likely due to their specialization. Their cells must be highly specialized in a way that makes them very radio resistant. The highest measured dose a human has ever survived was 8.5 gray. And then the LD100-60 is 7 gray with medical treatment available. When it's not, that goes down to about 6 gray. Medical treatment will account for being able to rehydrate the body via intravenous lines, provide nutrients via that same route, and administer antibiotics likely via that same route, whereas the person exposed to that would not be able to absorb those things through their digestive system. So the medical treatment is basically doing things to support life at that point. A reminder of these lethal doses: the LD5030 for humans, 3.5 to 4 gray, the LD100-60, 6 gray without treatment, and the LD100-60, 7 gray with treatment. And for humans, keeping in mind, it takes a threshold dose because these are deterministic effects. So a threshold of at least 1 gray to be at risk of death. This demonstrates the reasoning for the LD5030. You'll notice using this graph, noticing a response above 1 gray and lethality around 6 gray with a exponentially increasing and decreasing response. The inflection point indicates that around 3.5 gray, you have 50% of the population die from this exposure and die within 30 days. Okay, now it's time to talk about the effects that I've been sort of leading up to. These are the lethal, life-threatening effects of radiation. and they occur at levels above diagnostic radiography, and likely even levels much higher than interventional radiography or radiation therapies. These are acute radiation syndromes, so these have been documented in the survivors of the Chernobyl blast and the Hiroshima-Nagasaki incidences. The first thing to talk about is what's called nausea, vomiting, diarrhea syndrome. And this is sublethal, and it occurs at less than 1 gray, so half to 1 gray. Humans subjected to high amounts of radiation not exceeding 1 gray experience symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, accompanied by a feeling of general malaise or weakness. These symptoms typically subside after days with no further somatic implications of the individual, assuming the individual is healthy enough to survive through this in the first place. They will survive. This is not a form of acute radiation syndrome, and again, acute radiation syndrome is life-threatening, so requiring at least 1 gray to occur. But this is part of, you will see this as part of the other syndromes likely. ARS has 4 stages, like any disease has. A prodromal stage with which the individual feels sick after the exposure, similar to the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea syndrome. Shortly after, a period of improvement called the latent stage, and inversely proportional to exposure. So as the exposure goes up, the latent stage gets shorter and shorter. The manifest illness comes sooner and sooner with higher level exposures. So the manifest illness is the third phase, and again associated with an inverse relationship to exposure. This is the illness is there, it's present, and it is at its worst. After a period of time, the individual either undergoes death or recovers from the incident. There are 3 categories of ARS, and categorized according to the predominant, most immediate cause of death. So the first listed here, hematopoietic syndrome or hematologic syndrome, to do with blood cell suppression. Gastrointestinal syndrome, to do with damage to the GI system. And central nervous system syndrome, damage to the brain and spinal cord. Hematopoietic syndrome, poiesis or poetic as a suffix to the word, it means formation, formation of blood specifically in this case. Also known as bone marrow syndrome, risk of death is primarily caused from damage to bone marrow tissue. And so we see a severe depression of blood cell counts, which with a lack of erythrocytes, we see anemia. A lack of thrombocytes, we see hemorrhage, and a lack of leukocytes, we see serious infection. So anemia, hemorrhage, or serious infection is the likely cause of death in this case. So multiple severe infections being the most concerning of which. GI syndrome. The risk of death is primarily caused from damage to the lining of the small intestine. It causes irreversible desquamination of the GI lining, resulting in poor absorption of water and nutrients. What you see is a flattening of the villi in the intestines, so they lack the ability to absorb nutrients. So immediate cause of death, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and malnutrition, starvation. Death can also occur, again, from severe infection. These are occurring at increasing levels. So if you're at the level of seeing ARS GI syndrome, you've already satisfied the hematopoietic syndrome threshold. Central nervous system syndrome, the most severe, occurring at the extremely high levels, is higher than around 10 to 50 gray or so. The risk of death is primarily caused from acute damage to the brain due to intracranial pressure from bleeding, damaged blood vessels leaking, applying pressure on the brain, and damage in that way. Neural damage also occurring from lack of oxygenated blood due to the hematopoietic syndrome, suppressing blood counts. Mean survival times. defined as the average time from an acute lethal dose to death. Generally shortens with increasing whole body dose, so inverse relationship here. Dose goes up, mean survival time, average survival time goes down. Each subsyndrome of those three subsyndromes has its own characteristic mean survival times. So if you pass the threshold to achieve the syndrome, hematopoietic syndrome, death within 2 to 8 weeks, typically due to infection. GI syndrome, death in 4 to 10 days due to malnutrition and dehydration. And a central nervous system syndrome, death in 2 to 3 days due to acute brain pressure, inducing coma potentially within 6 hours. So within hours, we see death. And again, these are all on their own lethal. For hematologic syndrome, mean survival time decreases with an increase in dose. GI syndrome, mean survival time remains constant with an increase in dose. The time required to expire from starvation and dehydration is the same regardless of dose. So once it happens, it happens. And central nervous system syndrome, the mean survival time decreases with an increasing dose as well. Thresholds for these. Hematopoietic syndrome happens above 1 gray, so this is why deaths are said to occur above 1 gray. This syndrome occurs. GI syndrome above 6 gray, and CNS syndrome above 50 gray. Radiation levels for central nervous system syndrome are so high that manifest illness stage is reached within hours, 5 to 6 hours, the first two stages only lasting several hours each. And we see the victim go into a coma due to that severe intracranial pressure. Other early effects, we see local tissue damage from radiation, which can cause organs to atrophy in size as well as decline in their function. Erythema, or a sunburn-like reddening of the skin, which is a common side effect of radiation therapy. At high doses of radiation, a second wave of erythema is followed by desquamination of the skin, in which case ulcers begin to open. Threshold skin erythema dose, also known as the SED, is 2 gray. Epilation is hair loss due to radiation exposure, and it has a threshold dose of 3 gray. All right, thank you guys for listening through, and hopefully you made it through all of this, and I'd like you guys to check back on my next section. I'll be discussing the late effects of radiation, the stochastic effects. Thank you for listening.